Okay, this is going to be the overview for Chapter 9 on opioids. Let me say right up front that in the interest of not making these lectures overly long, I cut out the sections basically on the history of opioids, whether it be worldwide or in the United States. So make sure to fill in on, in terms of your own studying, that you pay particular attention in the chapter to those sections, because they're still important. But again, you got to find something to cut if the lectures are not going to be super long. So those sections I'm just going to skip right over those. Let's jump in to what we mean by opioid. The term opioid means opium-like. When you got oid on the end of a word, it means, like something. An opioid drug is any drug that bears a similarity to opium in terms of its pharmacological effects on the body and the mind or the brain. So opium, we know, is the naturally occurring drug that comes from the opium poppy plant, but it's amazing the number of different drugs that are either derived from opium or that have similar characteristics and properties like opium. We'll go over that longer list here in a moment. Technically speaking, all opioids share the common feature of binding to a common set of receptors in the brain. Okay, so there's nerve cells in your brain that have receptors that receive chemicals that connect to those receptors and then keep a communication, a signal going down the line of nerve cells. That's how the brain operates. And so the receptor is just a spot, a position that receives a molecule and attaches to it, and then it continues the signal moving down the line, activates a signal. So that's what we mean by receptors, and they're on individual nerve cells. Opioid drugs can be thought of as an extended opium family. So, family is a good word to use here because it's related substances. They're not all the same, but they're related. Some opioids are actually components of the naturally occurring the opium itself. So it could be parts of the opium, components of it. Some opioids are structurally derived from these components, while other opioids are not structurally derived, but have a functional similarity to the effects of opium. So again, some of them derived from opium and opium components. Other ones just have a similar structure. They don't come from opium, but they have a similar structure, which in the sense that they work the same. They're functionally the same. They attach to those receptors. And you can usually think of these biochemicals and receptors as kind of being like pieces to a puzzle. They either fit together or they don't. And so you have all these opium chemicals that are similar to each other in that they can fit in this receptor and functionally kind of work the same as or similarly to opium. The diversity of opioid drugs can be understood in terms of 4 broad categories. Let's move to the next slide. 3 natural components that are directly extracted from opium itself. This is number 1. Directly extracted from the opium itself. Morphine, been around for a long time. Codeine, and you find codeine in Tylenol with codeine 3 or 4. And Vebain. All opioids have their origin in these compounds. They are referred to as opioid extracts. So extracts means getting pulled from the opium. It's getting derived, extracted from the opium. So these again, remember that these compounds are extracted from the opium itself. Morphine, codeine, and Vebain. Number 2, derivative compounds that are created by making specific structural modifications in the chemical composition of morphine. Okay, so here we're taking morphine, one of those chemicals extracted directly from opium. We take those and we tweak the morphine. You tweak it, so that's what mean by structural modifications, and then you end up with these derivative compounds. The most well-known is heroin, again derived from morphine, but there's also hydromorphone and oxymorphone. So there's a lot of different compounds in this family of compounds. And when it comes to testing, I know these sorts of things can make you nervous, that there's a lot of different terms. But I'm not going to go down too far down that road of coming up with quiz questions that make you know all these different compounds. Just it's going to be the major, more big picture stuff, or the most common drugs that I'm most concerned about, like heroin, right? Not these drugs that you don't hear about very much. Number 3, derivative compounds that are created by making specific structural modifications in the chemical composition of codeine or thebaine. So those are the other 2 compounds derived from opium on top of morphine, is codeine and thebaine, right? So then we can get derivative compounds from those. Examples of that are oxycodone, getting even more specific with the brand names Percodan and Percocet. Some of these brand names you may have heard before. Okay, so we're talking there oxycodone. The extended release form of oxycodone. So there we're talking about extended release, a slower, more extended release of that particular drug. So it's a variation on that brand name OxyContin, which you may have heard of before. Hydrocodone, brand names Vicodin and buprenorphine. Some of these are a real mouthful to say. Again, less common ones you definitely don't need to worry about. I'm going to keep it pretty simple in terms of testing, because knowing all these different drugs is not really the point. The point is just seeing the overall picture and knowing how many different things are derived from opiums, and they're similar opiums, and our lab sort of variants that are derived differently than getting it from opium, etc. Kind of big picture stuff is what I'm looking at. Drugs that are created entirely in the laboratory as opposed to being derived from the opium plants, and that bear no structural similarity to any opioid in the first 3 categories. This is the number 4 categories. They are referred to as synthetic opioids. See, now that's a good term to know, synthetic, what it's referring to, because that's a category of drugs. And so what do we mean by synthetic? It means that it's made in the laboratory. It's not coming from the plant. It has the same function, a similar, I should say, functional effect. It kind of works in a similar way, but it's made in the lab. It doesn't come from the plant, right? It's just similar. Okay, so that's synthetic, meaning made in the lab as opposed to naturally occurring, right? Okay, examples of illegal, or I should say legal first, licit or legal prescription medications that are this synthetic type, synthetic opioids, made in the lab: methadone, meperidine with the brand name of Demerol, propoxyphene, brand names Darvon and Darvocet, and finally the big one for our current social situation, fentanyl. Okay, fentanyl, synthetic, lab made, right along with all these other ones: methadone, meperidine, propoxyphene, mouthfuls, all of these. Okay, fentanyl's the important one there now, most important one there nowadays. Various fentanyl analog compounds, such as carfentanil, manufactured illegally in clandestine overseas laboratories and smuggled into the United States, are examples of illegal or illicit synthetic opioids. So lab-made, but they're illegal. You don't have the legal version of these. Big type or name there, carfentanil. But again, not something I'm really going to stress too much to get into be too specific. See, so here we're just laying out the extended opium family visually, okay? So I won't go over all of these again, and there's some additional ones too. But notice, I think the looking across the, if you look at it across the rows, there's four levels here. And you got your pure opium at the top, and then you've got your extracts, morphine, codeine, and V-bane, and that gray level below the green level, which are those types of drugs derived from morphine, codeine, and V-bane, right? And then at the very bottom, you've got your synthetic opioids, and a whole bunch of those. Again, you don't need to know all of these, but you can see how there's kind of four categories here of opioids. Since around 1900, so over 100 years, opioid drugs have been commonly referred to as narcotics. Now, where do we get this term narcotic from? Well, from the Greek word stupor or sleepiness. Narc is sleeping. It's related to the word sleeping. And so it's based on their ability to produce a dreamlike experience and at higher doses induce a state of sleep. So dreaminess, sleepiness, being asleep, that's what narcotics refers to. That's what that term, the root of that, is referring to sort of drugs that make you, put you in sort of a sleepy dream state or actually cause you to fall asleep. But in fact, the term narcotic was used at one time inappropriately, inaccurately, to mean any illicit psychoactive drug, or at least any drug that caused some degree of dependence, addiction, including such unlikely drugs as cocaine and amphetamine, which are stimulants. So, we to this day will call all these drugs narcotics, but it's inaccurate and kind of weird to call cocaine and amphetamines narcotics, which again, narcotic meaning sleep inducing. But cocaine and amphetamine are just the opposite. They crank you up. They make you the opposite of sleepy. They make you hyper aware, hyper vigilant, very up, not down. But you're still calling them narcotics, like they're going to put you to sleep, which is the last thing in the world that they do. So it's a strange kind of holdover remnant of our past that we're still using this term narcotics. The beginning of the 20th century marked the beginning of the latest and most deadly wave of opiate abuse in American history. Again, I'm skipping all the history stuff and coming up to basically at least recent times, 21st century, right? Two major factors were at work during this time. Number one, firstly, the rise in prescription opioid medications. That's the first thing that kicked off our current crisis. And number two, the introduction of illegal fentanyl and fentanyl analogs into street heroin. Okay? So these are two very important trends from the past 20 plus years. Is number one, that pharmaceutical companies and doctors pushed opioids as legal prescribed medications, overprescribed those. A lot of people became dependent, became addicted, and if the prescription drugs were unavailable or too expensive, these people who were addicted would in turn turn to the street and get opioids from the street illegally. For example, heroin. Or now more recently, fentanyl and fentanyl-laced drugs of various types. But there's sort of the chain of events. Opioid medications, prescribed medications first problem, and then followed up by these street drugs, particularly fentanyl in recent years. Now, as I usually do, have here a graph that's updated from the textbook. The textbook's several years behind. So here we have a couple of graphs which are measurements of the amount of prescription opioid use as it unfolded over the past, say, 30 plus years. And if you look at the graph on the left, here on the x-axis, you've got the years all the way up the newest year, most recent year, 2021. And then on the y-axis, you've got sort of like how much morphine, a particular prescribed opioid was being prescribed sort of per person over this period of time. Long story short, big picture, as you can see that like the shape of a mountain, starting at 1992, you see this increase that really takes off in the later 90s and just rockets up to a peak in about 2011, and then then quite quickly also falls up to the present day. So the peak over a decade ago. This is prescription opioids. And just a rocketing and a huge increase because it became much more available, much more pushed, much more just dispensed, given out to patients in a prescribed legal fashion. Okay? Now, the right graph here is looking at more recent years and how much that has dropped because once we get to the mid, or let's say 2011, in the 20 teens, the American society begins to see that we really went overboard with prescribing opioids, and the doctors and pharmacies or pharmaceutical companies reversed course and brought down the amount of prescriptions dramatically. Here you can see from the earliest year in the graph, 2016, up to 2021, you can see big decrease in prescriptions of this measure of opioids. And the different lines are just different types of doctors who are prescribing these drugs. But we don't need to worry about all that. Big picture is the overall. You could look at add them all together. That's the dotted line. It's a dramatic decrease over, almost the past decade. Now, so what's the big story there? Big, enormous increase in prescription opioids, 90s, 2000s. You get up to about 2011, and then dramatic drop since that time because we started to learn our lesson. Let's stop there, and we'll continue on in part 2.